Welcome. I'm Will Aremus, Senior Technology Writer for Slate. We're here to talk about whether technology will make ownership obsolete. This is a production of Future Tense, which is a partnership between New America, Arizona State University, and Slate Magazine that explores emerging technologies and their transformative effects on society and public policy. Central to this partnership is a series of events in Washington, D.C. and New York City, and the blog on Slate. In addition to regular editorial content published on Slate, we've launched Futurography. It's a hybrid of journalism and digital learning, where each month we choose a new technology or idea and break it down. We ask, what's the state of the science? Who are the researchers leading its development? What are the primary ethical and policy debates involved? And the theme this month is the end of ownership, which served as an inspiration for this event. A couple housekeeping items. Please silence your cell phones. We will have some Q&A at the end of each panel. During the Q&A, we will be live streaming the event, so please wait for the microphone before you start speaking, or else nobody will be able to hear you. And make your comment in the form of a question with a question mark at the end. Got it? Question. All right. You can follow the discussion online using the hashtag FTOwnership, all one word, and follow us at Future Tense Now, also all one word. Now I'd like to invite the speakers for our first conversation to the stage. Our first speaker is Lauren Beliv, Senior Federal Government Relations Manager for Lyft. Welcome, Lauren. We have Holly Main, Senior Director of Mid-Atlantic Sales for Spotify. Welcome, Holly. And Susan Lund, Partner at McKinsey Global Institute. Welcome, Susan. Our first conversation is titled, Why Own Anything When You Can Access Everything? I'm going to sit down and then we can start our conversation. All right. Lauren, let's start with you. Cars are an exciting space right now. Cars have been much the same for decades. The industry is changing fast. Talk a little bit about the future of cars, how it's changing, how fast it's changing, and what might not change, what might change and what might not change in the next decade or two in terms of whether we buy cars, whether the cars drive themselves, and what that means for our ownership and our relationship to cars.
Well, first, thank you so much. I'm so pleased to be here. Right off the bat, I get the same question probably every single day. What's the difference between Lyft and Uber? And it really comes down to how we were founded. Uber was founded to be a taxi alternative, and they started with luxury black cars. Lyft, on the other hand, was founded to be a full alternative to car ownership. We have two co-founders who were studying all these different inefficiencies in the market, where 80% of seats on highways were empty, and people own these cars, these assets, but they're only using it 4% of the life of the car. And the other 96% of the time, the car remained parked. And when you think about what car ownership means today, people spend, on average, $9,000 a year on cars, when you think about gas, maintenance, insurance. And when you look at how the trends are changing in the American cities today, you have millennials, they're moving into cities, they're getting more and more of the market buying power. Do you think they would like to have the burdens of ownership, or perhaps the access to services and services of rides through technology? And it's been a very interesting way that this trend is happening already organically. In 1983, the year that I was born, 43% of 16-year-olds got their driver's license. In 2014, only 24% of 16-year-olds got their driver's license. That was something I was 100% sure I wanted when I turned 16. And so you're starting to see this happening organically. With Lyft, what we've been seeing is a trend towards the self-driving car, and we see it as a way to help eliminate these inefficiencies in the market. If you think that 96% of the time a car is parked, that means that you have cars in cities on roads and in parking spaces just sitting unused. And if you can reimagine cities and the way that people utilize cars, we can get rid of parking spaces. And that could be a real way to bring more commerce into cities. Instead of parking, have parks, more housing for people. And so we're really excited to see what that means. At Lyft, we believe that in urban environments, people will stop owning cars completely by the year 2025. And so that's a fast timeline, but it's one that I think is already well on its way.
That's very soon. What about in suburban and rural environments?
That's something that we're going to see the trends go a little bit more gradual. And I think with the deployment of autonomous vehicles, first you're going to see this in urban environments, likely in slow speeds. And as the technology grows richer and the testing becomes more concrete, you'll see that move to suburban and rural environments as well.
Yeah, I think we just had news today of the first self-driving truck shipping 50,000 cans of Budweiser about 120 miles down the highway. But I should note that it was following a path that had been very well mapped out for it in advance for 2 weeks. And I believe there was a police cruiser following along behind. So we're a little bit of a ways away from all our beer being shipped around the country via self-driving truck. Holly, can you talk a little bit about the trends from music ownership to music as a service?
Sure. So I think there are a lot of similarities to some of the things that Lauren touched on. I think for Spotify, we were in the streaming business before streaming started to become mainstream, which is where it is today. I mean, we're a 10-year-old company, Swedish in its roots, but we feel happy to see streaming starting to pick up because we've been waiting for that to start happening. Our general feeling is that with a shift in consumption driven primarily from, by millennials and the advent of just technology and smartphones and the devices that we're really, all of us as individuals are kind of dependent on, that we are able to bring more music to more people with more diverse backgrounds and people that may not have had access to it or even known that they liked it, certain genres and things like that, to more people than we were ever able to do when it just came down to buying that CD or buying that piece of vinyl for those of us that are my age. I probably dated myself. But vinyl's coming back, so it proves the adage, what's old is new again. So, we feel from our position that streaming, we're seeing all of those things start to pick up, and that, we have 2 tiers, so if people do want to pay for something and kind of, own a more customizable experience with music, they can certainly do that, but that I think the trend is that, to Lauren's point, people want what they want when they want it, and they want it customizable, and it's more about experience than it is about the ownership, having that 400 LP collection and things like that.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a lot of the benefits to consumers are pretty easy to see. I mean, you just talked about having what you want when you want it. There's when we talk about turning goods into services, you have the chance to get access to things that you would never be able to afford to own. But there's another side to this, which is what about the people involved in these economies? What about the workers? This is something you've looked at closely, Susan Lund. When we talk about cars, Lyft and Uber have provided employment opportunities for a lot of people. At the same time, some of those same people are anxious now about this transition to self-driving cars. I mean, are those jobs going to be obsolete? And when we look at something like Spotify, the musicians, we've heard some complaints at times about are they really able to make a living when people just stream their music instead of buying it at a store. Susan, what are some of the trends in terms of how employment and jobs and economies are being affected by these transitions?
Well, the short answer is they're being affected a lot. And there are 2 big things that we're talking about here. One is automation, like self-driving cars, and then there's the independent work. What happens to the workers? Do you have a job with one full-time employer? The automation part is still to be seen. I mean, if we do move to a sharing economy, the auto industry and the supply chains around automotive is like a major employer in the US still today. So if we do move to a point where none of us own cars and there's a fleet of cars driving us all around, I think we'd have something like 90% fewer car sales each year. I mean, that is a huge hit to US manufacturing. So what happens to all those people? I don't have great answers on the automation point, but we just did release a study that's out in the lobby for those who are interested on the gig economy, or what we call independent work. And the government statistics on this are really poorly done. The way policymakers and most people, although this is a pretty young room, but say your parents thought about employment as like a payroll job with one employer. And those are the jobs numbers that are released the first Friday of every month, and everyone's watching carefully. And we do a very poor job of tracking, but actually a huge part of the population doesn't make their living having one traditional employer. So we did our own survey in the US and 5 European countries. What we found in the US is that 27% of the working age population, so almost 1 in 3 people today, don't just have one traditional job. They're either a full-time freelancer or self-employed person or independent contractor, or they're using the gig economy like driving for Lyft or Uber as a supplement to their other main economic activity. So I think along with the sharing economy, it's interesting because for people who want to be their own boss and not have a traditional job, things like Uber and TaskRabbit and Upwork and Airbnb enable you to more easily than ever put together a bunch of different income streams and then make a living that way. So it is a whole new world, and the trend has been, we think, growth in this, although we've only done a survey at one point of time, but there's other research to suggest that over the last 10 years, the share of people in alternative work arrangements has grown quite significantly, and the sharing economy might actually spur an even faster shift in that direction.
Yes, there's some ambiguity when we talk about the sharing economy in terms of what we're really talking about. And there's a few different related strands that we're discussing here today. So there's something like, when we're talking about cars and car sharing, in some cases, people are actually sharing a car together. In other cases, it just means that there's one car that's going around and picking up different people over the course of the day. Something like music, it's not sharing, but we're still talking about a transition from something that you used to own to something that you now subscribe to, and it has gone from basically a good to a service. And then, in a sense, what you were talking about, Susan, with the economy, employers are sharing workers, right? I mean, they never owned their workers, but they used to have a defined number of workers who gave them their full attention, presumably, and now there's a sort of sharing among these gig economy companies. Can each of you, so we've talked about cars, we've talked about music, I think another really obvious one, other types of media, I mean, Netflix, people are streaming movies and TV. Can each of you name a non-obvious area? Because it's very easy to go from a couple of well-defined examples of things that are now being shared or that have moved from a good to a service, and say, well, everything is moving from a good to a service, but not everything is, right? I mean, people, for the most part, people still own their own clothes. We still own our own, our computers and our personal devices and that sort of thing, our home appliances. But what's something else besides your own area? And maybe Lauren, you can start that you see being shared either now or in the future.
Great. One thought that just comes to mind is the way that cities are changing, the nature of work is changing. You're seeing the rise of incubators and shared workspaces and people kind of coming together and sharing their brain trusts in ways that helps advance them, I would say, in a professional manner in some ways, but it also has changed the nature of work in a lot of ways as well, because you're not going to a static one work environment anymore, and you're seeing these kind of honeycombs of work systems that are starting to form across cities and in suburbs and in rural environments as well. Like WeWork, exactly.
I would say, well, you touched on it, clothing, right? You've got Rent the Runway. So that's one. There's luxury services. So, there's apps now where you can schedule massages. Velux is an app that comes to mind. Massages, blow dries, all of that, they will come to your home and they will do it for you. So it, some of it is convenient. Some of it, again, is I want it when I want it and how I want it. Snacks, Graze. You can have just a customizable snack box delivered to you. There's a lot.
From a labor perspective, we went through long esoteric discussions on what couldn't be filled by a freelancer or an independent worker? And the answer is very little. I mean, you can imagine apps where in retail, in fast food, in dry cleaners, people pick up a gig through an app and say, I'm going to work this shift and come in and do it and leave. So we see it in medicine. I mean, highly specialized surgeons share their services on a piecemeal basis across the economy, get paid for each surgery they do, and they'll go to this hospital and the next one and the next one. So in the world of work, Ronald Coase 30 years ago wrote this seminal article about why is there a corporation? Why is there a company? And at the time he said because it is easier to manage people and it reduces transaction costs to have people within your company than contracting everything out to the marketplace. But what apps and digital platforms are doing now is completely changing that equation. So it's cheap, it's efficient, it's transparent. You get this whole pool of potential workers. So I think it's a long transition, but you can imagine the size of large companies shrinking in terms of their full-time employees. There's some knowledge you're going to want to keep in-house, but a lot more can be done on a project task-based basis with independent contractors. And this is a shift. It's not new. We've seen the evolution of outsourcing with companies for the last 10 to 20 years. But these new on-demand platforms and apps for labor could actually, we may see another wave of that type of shift.
Yeah, I was thinking about what's really new and what's old in terms of sharing. I mean, obviously the idea that of sharing things is not novel. We've had, for a long time, we've had public libraries. We've shared taxi cabs, in a manner of speaking. We've rented tuxedos and prom dresses. And we share a lot of services that are provided by the government, infrastructure, public transit. I wondered, are some of those more old school forms of sharing at risk from these new forms of for-profit sharing? So libraries might be one example. Public transit might be another one. I mean, how do you think about Lyft's effect on public transit? And in a world where we can hail a car at any time, does that just encourage the kind of sprawl and the car-dominated environments that we thought we were maybe beginning to move away from?
Yeah, no, that's actually a wonderful question. We don't view ourselves as a competitor to mass transit at all. We actually view ourselves as a complement. One of the beauties of how this isn't a taxi alternative is there's data all around where the rides are coming and going, and there's heat maps. And you see there's a huge population of Lyft riders now who are we would call them underserved transportation populations, people who live too far from bus stops, too far from metros, and the idea that you can get a ride door to door to the trains. We have a product called Lyft Line where that's a shared ride, and for a reduced cost, in some places $3, you can get a ride in a Lyft if you share it. 70% of our rides in San Francisco are line rides now, and 30% of those rides are happening 100 meters from a transit station. So people are actually starting to look at this as a complement to how they're utilizing transit. And I think one of the big things, the theme that I'm hearing through is, there has to be a consumer demand that drives all of this. Uber and Lyft came to the scene, and people all of a sudden could have a door-to-door ride without the serendipitousness of trying to hail a cab if the cab was there. They know it was coming. There's a seamlessness. You don't have to pay, and with a credit card, you can kind of have a whole much more easier experience. And that's something that consumers really loved. You see other technologies that emerged that just didn't work out in the first iteration. We're not sitting here wearing Google glasses right now, maybe in a couple years, but not yet. And it just wasn't consumer ready. And so that's something I think, too, is no matter what industry you're in and no matter what market, it's the consumer drive, the consumer choice that's going to be really amplifying how people are going to be using these emerging technologies.
You all can feel free to jump in, too, at any point if you want. I wanted to also ask, did you have something on that, Susan? Okay. I wanted to ask about what we will still own 10 years or 20 years from now. What doesn't lend itself to being transformed into a service that you subscribe to, or something that you hail on demand on your smartphone. Do any of you guys have ideas on that?
Yeah, I'd say whatever we care about. I find myself funny that I don't consider myself a car person, but there are a lot of people who like to own a car. They love their car, and I have to say I bought a new car, and it's really fun to drive. So I think what we're going to own is what we care about, what we want to own. If we do, I know plenty of women who may continue to buy designer clothes and keep them in their closet because they're theirs. Others, won't do that. But I think it brings a lot more choice. You'll own what you actually care about.
That's an interesting point, and I like that sort of pithy formulation of what we'll still own. It's what we care about. But I imagine that you guys might push back on that a little bit, because I think you would both say that people probably still care about cars, probably still care about music, but you are still, you still think that they will move from ownership to streaming. I think there are powerful personal feelings around this, though. I mean, we heard a story a few months ago of someone who claimed that Apple Music had stolen his music, that it had somehow converted the MP3 files on his computer. It had replaced them with files that were available on the cloud through Apple Music, and then some of them were gone, and music that he owned was gone. And there was a whole sort of forensic investigation to try to get to the bottom of what exactly happened. But doesn't that show, Holly, that people still do maybe want to own their music, if at least the songs that they like the most or the artists they like the most?
I mean, streaming, I think about my own personal, like when I listen to music, I shouldn't probably say this sitting up here as an ambassador of Spotify, but sometimes I stream from other services, depending on, but it really depends on what I'm doing, right? If I'm having a dinner party and I just want music to play, maybe I might not stream from Spotify. If I want to do things that are more customized and I want to listen to things I've created, maybe Spotify is going to be a better, platform for me. I have LPs, I have vinyl that I still love, and I love the sound of it. And sometimes I want to listen to that. So I think it's about, I want to say, I think what we're going to own are maybe less of the actual material side of things, but the experience and the joy and things like that these services bring you, if that makes any sense. And it's a little bit of what Susan touched on. Like, you're going to own what you want to own, and some of that is going to be the actual experience and not necessarily the distribution channel or the hard materialistic good.
Yeah, you had mentioned that vinyl sales have been going up. I think that's an interesting case in point, because once we can get most of the music we want easily on demand through a service like Spotify, maybe the stuff that we really care about when we do own it, we want to really have that sort of tactile analog experience with it. So maybe, I don't know, does that imply that maybe in the future, if you really love cars, you'll rent your little electric buggy to get around. You'll hail it on your phone, but maybe you'll still have your classic Ford Mustang in the garage or something like that.
I remember my very first car was a 740 turbo fire engine red Volvo wagon, and I loved it. My brother totaled it, which is a whole nother situation. But it's something where people do. They have a love affair with cars, and in the 1960s, getting your driver's license and going onto the open road was a freedom. And now it really has become much more of a burden. And you think about how much space in your house are dedicated to hardcover books and DVDs that now you don't need to utilize that space. It's the same idea with parking. And I can't remember if I said this, but in the United States right now, there's more parking than the entire square mileage of the state of Connecticut. And I think there's different ways to start really thinking about how can you utilize space and think about it. And so I think there will be a gradual balance, and it will be organic. I mean, the world is not going to go autonomous overnight. And you will see human-driven cars and autonomous vehicles operating side by side as the technology continues to emerge. So it will be interesting to see how this works.
Yeah, I would say, actually, to contradict what I just said,
I think
I think that the next generation could be much less about tangible goods. This could be a generational issue, because I look at my kids, a teenage daughter who is finally, at my sort of pushing, learning to get a driver's license. But there was no need, because she can take Lyft and Uber around. And so driving is a service. She may never love to drive the way I do. they don't buy vinyls and books. They don't have physical books. They don't have physical music. Like they're growing up without this notion of these things as a tangible good. So people like me might actually say, I read a lot of books, ebooks, but for a really good novel, I'll go buy a hard copy and put it on my bookshelf. But and they may not do that. So 15 years out, we may in fact be in a world that's much less about physical goods and much more digital.
And going back for a second to the idea of the gig economy and people sort of not owning a job, right, but having these different gigs that sustain them. Are these people making a good living? Do they feel like they have job security? Are some of these people counted as unemployed despite having gigs?
So it's I don't even want to get into how the government counts things. The answer to that is who knows. We didn't ask about income, so getting people to tell you about their income is very difficult to do accurately. But we did ask a 14 points of how satisfied or unsatisfied are you with different elements of your work life. And we asked this of everyone, so people with traditional jobs as well as independent workers. And what we find is that on 12 of the 14 metrics, people who are independent workers are more satisfied with the elements of their work life. And this includes income level and income security. And on 2 measures, including healthcare benefits, they're equally satisfied with traditional workers. So we don't know what their income is, but we do know they're very happy with what they're doing. And there's other work, like a study by the JP Morgan Institute that tracked people's income, found that people that do gig work or independent work have less variable income than payroll employees. So that's really interesting. So it is a way of filling in when, if you're working part-time, you don't get the number of hours you want. Or when you look at non-salaried people, their income is actually quite volatile. So.
Yeah, and going back to that theme of owning things that you care about, I mean, if you don't have a career, if you don't have a full-time job, a career is something you can care about. It's something that you can pour your passion into. If you have a variety of gigs, maybe those are not things that you're able to be as passionate about, but maybe it frees you to pursue a different kind of passion in life. But there is this question of security. When you don't own something, can it be taken away from you? Not just a gig. I mean, if you're an Uber driver, you know that your company's plan is to make you obsolete eventually. But your media, if you on Spotify, you could have that. If Spotify goes down, then you don't have any music. We had that outage, the DNS outage the other day because of the DDoS attack. Right, the DDoS attack on a domain name server took down all sorts of services across the web, and Netflix went down for a bunch of people. And guess what? Nobody's been buying DVDs because they have Netflix. So is there a downside to ownership, a downside to access over ownership, in the sense that something could go down or be taken away from you?
Sure. I mean, it could go down, right? Like that's technology. I mean, I feel like that every day at work when my computer crashes. And I'm like, computers are great when they work, right? And you have to wait for everything to reboot and things like that. So again, I mean, I think sure, there's a downside. You're relying on technology and things like that, which is, I'd say 95% of the time works in our favor, but there's always that moment where it might not. I don't know.
And just 2 thoughts on it. The first, even in the non-digital world, things do break down. Your car will need to go in for services, and it's part of life. For us too, you touched on shared economy drivers. Our drivers at Lyft, are as much a consumer of the platform as our riders, and they're the lifeblood of our platform. And yes, we are going towards an autonomous future, but so is the whole world. And we see in some ways that our driver numbers in the next few iterations of the chapters of Lyft are actually going to be increasing. And we're going to continue to look at ways that we can support our drivers with what they need. And so that's something we take very seriously at Lyft, just to let everyone know.
And then also,
I would
go ahead.
say, this has been a very optimistic panel, but I think cybersecurity is a real issue, and privacy. So in this digital world where everything is streamed, guess what? Spotify knows what I like to listen to because they're always suggesting more things I'd like to listen to. And our phones know, where we are. So I think that the issues of cybersecurity and privacy are real downsides and could be major blockages to realizing this future if we don't solve them.
Yeah, and I think for a lot of people, that's what prevents them from signing up for services, right? I think it's very much generational. Millennials don't think as much about it. This is a generalization. But you talk to older demographics, and it's the reason they don't want an online bank. It's the reason they don't download apps. It's the reason my father has a flip phone with electrical tape around it because he will not buy a smartphone because he's convinced it's going to track him and he might be onto something. So yeah, I mean, and for Spotify, and I would assume for Lyft as well, that data is, I mean, we're so protective of it, right, from a consumer standpoint and from, to be candid, a product development standpoint. So yeah, it's creepy. We can probably figure out your personality and your day based on what you stream. But we also have like 85 passwords that we have to log into every single day to make sure that that stays protected. And it's a reason why we won't get into advertising partnerships with certain companies because we won't release that first-party data. So it's a huge concern.
Yeah, and that I'm really glad you brought that up. I mean, it's not just security and the idea that something can be taken away from you if you don't own it. It's also that the people who do own it can monitor your usage of it at all times and can, in theory, restrict your usage of it. If you had an encyclopedia at home, you can look up whatever you want and nobody's going to track it. But when you use Google, Google is tracking what you're searching and they're building a profile of you for advertisers. And so that's another potential downside to this transition. I wanted to also talk about one more upside, and then we'll go for some question and answer from the audience. It seems like one way I've seen that companies that offer subscription or sharing services are able to give people a little bit of a sense of ownership is through customization. I mean, one of the really smart things that Spotify has done, I started using the free version of Spotify, and you start building playlists on there. And once you've put all that time and effort into playlists, those are yours. You sort of, you feel like you own those, and then you want to listen to those playlists, but they're within Spotify, and so maybe you sign up for the premium. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the idea of how you personalize a car that's not yours. I've heard the CEO of GM has talked a little bit about their ideas for how you can maybe step into a car and your smartphone can give you an experience that's your own.
Yeah, and we have a wonderful partnership with GM looking for the future, and it's this idea of, you can reinvent the idea of a car. You're coming off of work and you're going to the Nats game. Maybe you can call a sports lift, and it will come. And for us too, it's all about efficiency. So you can have a few different fans in the car. You could be streaming the pregame in the car, and you could be going to the game. And it's a whole different idea of how people are thinking about it now and slogging through traffic. Maybe there's a Wi-Fi, a quiet lift, and you're able to drive through. And maybe you work a little bit outside of the city, but you can take your autonomous Wi-Fi lift and do your morning emails before your lunchtime meetings. And so that's something that you can kind of start thinking about in different ways. And then the other piece too is if you're reinventing an idea of the car, you look at, and this is something that Lyft is doing now, but different populations, like senior mobility, where people who may not be able to drive for themselves anymore all of a sudden lose that spontaneity in life. And now, at a touch of a button, they can be able to have a car at their fingertips to go to medical appointments, to go to grocery shopping, and do all the things that they want to do. And it's changing the way that people are living their life overall, and that's ownership that they're able to, I think, get back, and that's exciting.
So let's see, we can go and see if anyone in the audience has a question that they want to ask. And remember, if you are called on, to wait until you have the mic to ask your question.
Hi there. I'm curious about the idea of workers' unions, how the gig economy and these, there have been court cases, I think, in LA or California with Uber and its workers. How does this change the way unions work and their relevancy in the future?
Do you have any thoughts? Is that something you've looked at, Susan?
Well, I can't comment on the specific court cases. I'm not a lawyer, thankfully, but I am an economist, which some people might think is even worse. I think that the whole idea of unions and guilds is an interesting one because you can imagine them getting new life. So the freelancers union, gets group health insurance rates for its members. The Hollywood Screenwriters Guild is a great example. They do some compensation negotiation, but they provide a range of training and benefits like retirement and health insurance. So I think that there's definitely an opportunity, and it could be guilds and unions, to do things like benefits, income security, training and career progression, and then all the back office stuff. So the fact is, a lot of people who want to be a gig worker, a freelancer, like, sure, I'll do some economics research for you, but I'm not good at marketing and sales for myself, and I certainly don't want to file my taxes. So I think that there's a whole ecosystem of different services to enable people that want to be their own boss to do all that kind of back office scut work that they're not good at and don't know how to do and don't want to do. And maybe it's unions start to move in that direction.
I think it's a really worthwhile point, because we have an economy and a social system that has been built up around the idea of goods, of manufacturing goods, of distributing them, of selling them at retail stores, and we know how to build an economy and a society around that. I think we're still probably figuring out how you build a society around an economy full of services, and included in that is the people who are working part-time jobs. One interesting trend I would note, my former colleague Ali Griswold has a great newsletter called Oversharing. It's all about the so-called sharing economy. And I was reading her latest issue of it, and she was talking about a series of companies, a series of startups in these realms that are explicitly hiring their workers as employees rather than as contractors, and in many cases giving them a share of equity in the company. Now, these are not so far the leaders in their spaces. They're upstarts, and we will see how that model fares against the contractor model. But at least, maybe that at least provides some hope for the idea that the sharing economy could lead to stable and fruitful careers. Yes.
I'm wondering about linking platforms going forward. I don't have a Facebook, which is normally not a problem. I just log into things with my email, and there are some things that I can't access, but it's really okay. But one reason an app would want to use Facebook is for sort of central ID verification. So thinking about consolidation of ID verification going forward, if that's a concern, are we thinking we might have a consumer super user ID or something provided by a Google or a Facebook, where through that I would log into my Rent the Runway and my Uber and my Spotify? And if there are any conversations about that you've heard, what are some of the concerns around that too, and or opportunities there?
Can you address how you log in, what your options are for logging into Spotify, maybe just to start?
Right. So ours is all based on your username, which is linked to an email address. I have not heard of having like a super consumer login. That's horrifying to me, to be candid, just to have everything in one place. Yeah, I wish.
It's a very good question.
It is a great question.
Facebook has wanted to be that sort of identity
Right.
service. Google Plus at one point had designs on being an identity service for the web. That sort of, didn't pan out. But I think, we actually had an event here at Future Tense a couple months ago that I moderated about virtual assistants and how they're becoming your portal to all these different online services. So if you have an Amazon Echo, you can use that to hail, I don't know if we have Lyft yet through the Echo. You can hail a car, you can use it to play your music. And then there's the question of, do those assistants do they gain control over what you have access to and what you don't have access to? And the question of interoperability is one too. Maybe you heard Tesla is working on a shared Tesla network. So once Teslas are autonomous and able to drive themselves, Elon Musk's idea is that you might have your Tesla drive you to work and then send it out to, and sort of rent it out to other drivers who can use it while you're at work, and then it'll come back and pick you up. It's called the Tesla shared fleet. This is a really nice idea. But the other day he revealed that his plan for this is that you would only be able to rent out your car through the Tesla shared fleet. So Tesla controls the algorithm that drives the car, so they consider Tesla to be the driver, so you don't own the car in the sense you can't now rent it out to somebody through Lyft. Does that worry you, this sort of battle for control?
I think the competition is a very healthy thing, and the more competition you have in the market, it's a good thing.
It is a little bit concerning. I mean, these platforms, there is a winner-take-all component to technology. And the digital ID is actually a really interesting and, I agree, concerning element. And now, as far as I know, I don't think I ever gave Facebook my social security number. So it might think it knows me because I've created an email account. But the fact is, so you could create fictitious accounts to get around this. But the idea that this all somehow could be linked actually to like a social security number or a true identification of me is interesting and horrifying.
Yeah, I think centralization is a real issue because if you have a retail environment, who gets store space is something that's figured out on a very decentralized basis. Tons of different people own land, and they can lease that commercial property to any number of tenants. And you can go to the mall and you could shop at Tower Records or go down the street and go to Best Buy. But when you're buying so much online, whether it's through the apps on your phone or whether it's through the Amazon Echo or that sort of thing, it's not clear that we'll have a level playing field. And I know that Spotify's stance has been that competition is healthy and all that, but the fact is that a big new rival is made by Apple, and Apple controls basically the digital equivalent of the mall. They get to put the Apple Music app front and center, and they can make it harder for you to get to the Spotify app, and they can take a cut off the top when you do use the Spotify app. So I think that the centralization is a real and serious issue. I think we have time for one more question.
My question has to deal more with, is this a shift because of desire or more of a shift out of necessity to sharing? We're coming out of the worst recessions in a long time. Many millennials face the burden of student loans. If the economy improves, do you think we'll see a shift back to ownership? Right now, the economy is still growing at a very slow rate. I know personally I would like to own my own car, but can't afford it because of student loans and other things like that. So do you think sharing might decrease once the economy starts improving?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Is it partly just economic anxiety, to borrow a term that's popular right now for other reasons? Is it just economic anxiety that's leading the younger generation to be willing to stream things and share things rather than own things? There's always that question with new technology when a younger generation adopts it. Is it just, is that the future, or is it just because they're young and as they get older, their habits will change? Any last thoughts on that from any of you?
You look at the United States and the history of the United States, we're a country that's built for cars. Highways, freeways, parking spaces. Our sidewalks are a certain size so that cars can park on it. And I think right now we're at the cusp of a huge transportation revolution where people are racing towards really reinventing the American city in a lot of ways, and it's going to be driven by this new way that people are going to be able to consume a car. And that's going to be exciting. So in terms of what the shifts are for ownership or not, at Lyft we hope that we will continue to share roads to make sure that we're reducing congestion, but we'll see how that movie ends.
We have to wrap up, unfortunately. Thank you so much to our guests, Lauren Belev of Lyft, Holly Main of Spotify, Susan Lund of McKinsey Global Institute. Thank you so much for joining us. So now for the second phase of our afternoon, I would like to invite Monica Potts to give a short presentation on the Post-Ownership Society. Monica Potts is a writer based in Manassas, Virginia. She is a fellow with the New America Foundation Asset Building Program, and she writes about a variety of subjects including poverty, politics, and culture. Monica Potts, thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about what the sharing economy is like for people as it's lived on the ground, and I think I'll address some of your questions about economic anxiety. And sort of the big thing I want to touch on, and if I forget to mention this again later, just add this sentence to kind of the end of every point that I make. And that's that we do want to make sure that people are participating in the sharing economy because it's what they prefer and they're not buying things because they don't want to own them, and not because they can't afford them. That this is that this is the result of moving down the economic ladder. And so I want to talk a little bit about young adults, millennials mostly, and the economic condition that they found themselves in before we talk about the sharing economy. So first, the oldest of us are now entering our late 30s. The youngest are in college now. And it's important to talk about the way that our adulthoods have been entirely shaped by the internet and other trends, which have also involved a lot of economic insecurity. So it's not just the Great Recession, it's also the recession that happened in the early part of the last decade, which is when I graduated. So I was born in 1979. I'm, by a lot of measures, one of the oldest millennials. And I graduated from college in the spring of 2002. That was after 9/11 and after the dot-com bust. And so my first job after college was with the city of New York, and the city government was just coming off a hiring freeze because of that recession and because of 9/11. And I had no idea. I knew I had a job when I graduated, but I had no idea when it was going to start. I had no idea when I was going to need to move to New York, and I just sort of had to be ready. And my first job was just up in the air for a really long time. And so for me and everyone I knew, the whole economy was really uncertain at that time. And we spent our 20s sort of catching up from that. This was especially true when we compared ourselves to the generation a little bit older than us, when the internet seemed like it was creating all these new industries and people were walking off after getting their diploma with really great jobs lined up. And obviously, those of us who went to college were better off than our age mates who were stuck working in the booming service economy, that was minimum wage jobs, barely above minimum wage. And those jobs were also really uncertain. They weren't getting full-time hours. They weren't able to move up the economic ladder. And so but those of us who did go to college also financed it mostly with debt. Since 1985, the cost of college has increased 500%. And so more people are borrowing money and more people are borrowing more money. The average student debt in 2004 for people who graduated that year was a little less than $20,000. And just 10 years later, it had grown to $30,000. And so college debt is fine if that translates to higher earnings down the road, but then after we graduated into this first recession, we experienced the Great Recession. And what was different for the Great Recession for millennials was that economic downturns often hit the youngest workers hardest, but the youngest group of workers hit by the Great Recession were hit harder, and they took longer to recover than that same age group did in earlier recessions in like the 1980s and 1990s. And at the same time, the other trend is that the cost of living has gone up, and the cities where the jobs are really increasing, so cities like Boston, New York, DC, and San Francisco, cost of living has gone up really, really dramatically. So what you find is that people who are trying to cover the basics, about 75% of their income is going to cover the basics. Just a point of comparison, in 1973, the 50% of people's incomes were going to the basics like housing, health insurance, and education. So a lot of millennials are spending almost all of their money on rent and health insurance. And so, that means a bunch of things. That means that they're living in these basic cities and they are not able to get to the point where they're owning homes. And so the group of millennials that are in their late 30s now bought homes at later ages and also bought fewer homes. So that means they're not building wealth. They are living in places, as they mentioned on the earlier panel, places that are underserved by city services. And so part of the reason that they're using things like Lyft and Uber to get home is that the city that they live in doesn't provide buses and metros to take them there. And so that's a different change. Their work lives are also uncertain, as was mentioned earlier. Almost 1 in 3 people are supplementing their incomes in one way or another, or they're working solely in the gig economy. And I'm freelancing as well, and so a lot of people are just freelancing straight out. And it has its benefits. It means that there's a lot of freedom, but there's also a lot of insecurity. And so, if you're a bartender and you also drive for Lyft, it just means that you could be working all the time. And the benefits to having a job that I don't think weren't mentioned before is that jobs are there for you when you experience a downturn. So if you're a Lyft driver and your car gets totaled, you're not going to be able to earn money in that time. If you're a worker and you get sick, there's nobody paying for your sick days. And so that really kind of changes the relationship people have to work. So things like the sharing economy tends to make lives possible for people. So if you are living in a city and you really can't afford your rent, you can go away for maybe a couple weeks at a time and rent your home out on Airbnb while you're on vacation. But that really also contributes to geographic inequality, because if you live in a place where no one wants to go, you're not going to be able to rent your place out on Airbnb. And if you are living in a place that doesn't have those kind of big booming jobs, or where Uber drivers aren't in demand, then the ways that you can supplement your income are kind of less. And in many cases, it's because people are not getting enough money from their regular 9-to-5 jobs. 9-to-5 jobs are scarcer, and they also don't pay as well as they used to. And because the cost of living has gone up so much, people aren't saving money for retirement. And these kinds of trends can have huge consequences down the road. If you're not buying homes and you're not building wealth as a younger person and you're not saving for your retirement, then even if you start doing that in your late 30s and early 40s, that's a step back. You have some catching up to do. And I think that that's what we're going to see a lot in 30 and 40 years when millennials start to retire, is that they were really set back by this time period. And the relationship that has to the sharing economy is just that if you've been supplementing your work with things like Uber, and the Uber fleet is replaced by driverless cars, then you haven't been building skills that other employers will necessarily see translates to their work. And how do you move on from an economy where you were just piecing together work when some of those pieces start to disappear? And during that time, you weren't contributing to a 401k, and you weren't buying a house and building wealth and able to save. And I also want to think about the ways that the sharing economy could take the air out of some of the solutions, some of the older kinds of sharing that we used to do that were mentioned before. There was an old form of sharing that we had, which was where we let the government do things like spread our risk around and do things for us. And government programs like public transportation, where we all together paid for a service that was able to get us around in cities, and also in even suburban areas and more rural areas. And that's also important because if new technologies like driverless cars take over, then people who can't afford to participate in that are locked out of these new technologies. If you can't afford to buy a driverless car, if you can't afford to rent or hail a Lyft or Uber, or if you can't afford the smartphone that does that for you, then you're going to start to see increasing inequality that's really broadly based around geography. And we also used to, as I said, use the government to share risk. And so I think there's also, because work lives are so insecure and consumer lives to some extent are insecure, I do think there's a bigger appetite now among younger workers to let the government or unions or other kind of more traditional seeming institutions take on some of that security for them and take on some of that risk for them. So things like the public option in health exchanges, I think there's a political appetite there that wasn't there before. So I think it's just important to continue to think about inequality and what people may or may not be able to afford if we're talking about ownership versus accessing services on a continuing basis. So that's it.
Thank you, Monica. Now I'd like to invite Jenna McLaughlin and the speakers joining her in our second conversation to the stage. Jenna McLaughlin is a reporter and blogger covering surveillance and national security for The Intercept. Previously, she covered national security and foreign policy at Mother Jones magazine as an editorial fellow. Jenna McLaughlin.
Hello, everyone. So this conversation is something a little bit new for me. At The Intercept, I tend to focus on national security and privacy and some of the scary things that came up in the last panel. But these issues of ownership are broader reaching than that, and I'm excited to talk to my panelists about it. So for our panel, it's called The Illusion of Ownership. And we touched on some of the concerns about losing our ownership of data, of services, but we will talk about some of the other pitfalls. So I'd like to welcome to stage my participants. Charles Dewan, who is the director of the Patent Reform Project at Public Knowledge, right here. And Public Knowledge, and he'll tell you more about it, but is working to reform patent law in order to enhance patent quality. And prior to joining Public Knowledge, he was a research assistant for Professor Paul Ohm, who I also know, so that's fun. And Patrick Ross is the Chief Communications Officer at the United States Patent and Trademark Office. And he'll be able to tell us a little bit more about what the administration is thinking about these issues. So, welcome. Great, so to start our conversation, I'd love to start with just kind of what are your guys' thoughts about the end of ownership and the pitfalls that might occur that were not addressed in the previous panel? What kind of things do we need to be thinking about besides, will we be able to access our Ubers and Lyfts and things like that?
So I'll go ahead and start. I thank you for having me here. I'm glad to represent the administration on this. I do feel that President Obama is truly our innovation president. We think about these kind of issues every day, so it's great to speak on it. Provocative title, The End of Ownership. I remember after 9/11, futurists talking about the end of history, but it seems we still are living it, right? This election would be a good example of that. I think you can think more broadly about the spectrum of ownership. And so to the previous panel, my 18-year-old son, he turned 18 today, is obsessed with cars. All I can think about is cars. His college won't let him have one as a freshman, but I know we're going to have that conversation this summer. He gets all his music through Apple Music, has no desire to buy music. My daughter is 21, lives in Los Angeles. Where better to own a car? No, she doesn't own a car. She takes a bus to and from work, and then uses Uber or Lyft to get around and see her friends or go to museums or bring groceries home from the Vaughns. So, but she loves vinyl. She's an audiophile. So I think it's important to remember, just as technologies change and we still have vinyl even though we went to CDs and MP3s, I think based on your economic situation, as we just heard from Monica, or your own personal taste, we're going to have different approaches to each different product or service we buy in terms of ownership, and I think that's all to the good.
Yeah, so again, thank you for inviting me to be on this panel, and thank you for putting it together. In terms of in terms of kind of like these ownership issues that we've been talking about, I find that the sharing economy is very exciting. I take advantage of Uber and Lyft all the time. But I think it's worth considering kind of why ownership is still important. And so I heard the story on the podcast 99% Invisible, which is a great podcast, where he talks about a design firm that designed the houses that were reconstructed for people who lost their houses during the Chilean earthquake. And the houses that they designed, they called them half a house. So they would build up, they would build a house, it looked like a traditional house. Half of it would have your rooms and your kitchen and your bedrooms and everything. The other half was unfinished. Why did they leave it unfinished? It was because they wanted to give the people who were moving into these houses the chance to have some ability to, make these their houses, to customize them, to build them in configurations that would be useful to them. The government provided building assistance services. And so, they talk about what this village looks like, and you go to it, and half the houses all look exactly the same, and the other half, some people haven't built them out at all. Some people have done all sorts of crazy stuff with them. Some people have built porches. It's sort of like half Stepford Wives, half Andy Warhol. And I think that really says something about why ownership is important. It's that it allows people to take advantage of their creativity and to do things that often are really unexpected. The professor at MIT, Eric von Hippel, he's done a lot of studies on what's called lead user innovation. The idea that when people, when people purchase things, sometimes they come up with really creative uses that you wouldn't expect. They might turn paper plates into frisbees, for example. And that sort of creativity, I think, is something that really drives people forward, just on an individual matter. I think this is really important to people in, just their daily lives, but also as a society, because, we take advantage of the learning that each of us can do. We put it up on the internet, teach other people how to do it. You go to a website like lifehacks.com, right? You learn all sorts of things that you wouldn't have expected. That I think is something that's really valuable to society, and it's something that depends on the basic right of ownership, which allows you to do, unexpected things with what you have.
Right, and I think that that's a really interesting issue and something that we can explore in a lot more depth in terms of, you know, we aren't really sure sometimes how much we own specific things. I mean, our homes, you know, that's something physical. You sit in your house all day, you're like, this is my pillow, this is my chair, I own this. I could paint it a different color, whatever you're thinking about that. But in terms of my phone and the software that's running on it, you know, there are updates to that every couple days sometimes, you think, and you don't really read through what's going on in that update. Oftentimes it's something good. I mean, oftentimes it's a security update that you definitely should use. But we don't necessarily know what's going to happen with those, and we don't necessarily have a choice in terms of what is coming from that. So how does our perception of ownership in the digital space sort of spill over to the physical, and how much do manufacturers actually own certain objects?
Yeah, I mean, I think the really interesting thing these days is, for a long time, chair. I assumed I own my chair. Notebook. I assume I own my notebook. Computer software. I'm not totally sure, right? You have to sign that giant EULA thing that nobody actually reads. And it says like, actually, you've signed away all your rights. And so for a long time, that was kind of like a simple distinction. Actually, there are a lot of court cases that follow this sort of distinction. That software is one thing and physical stuff is another thing. But today we've got all these Internet of Things devices, right? Your car's got a computer in it. Your thermostat's got a computer in it. I don't know, your cat feeder's got a computer in it, so it can feed the cat at certain times. And what that means is you've got this kind of merger of things, and the boundaries of ownership aren't really as clear anymore. The companies who are manufacturing these devices are still taking advantage of the same techniques that they use in the software field to say, you don't actually own this, we're only providing you with a license, so we can take it back from you whenever you want, or you're not allowed to use it on Sundays, or who knows what. But it's a little different between saying you're not allowed to use iTunes for an improper purpose versus you're not allowed to use your thermometer for an improper purpose. And I think what's happening is that people are starting to recognize that as devices have more software in it, and as they're having to click through more of these contracts in order to just own their own in order to acquire their physical devices, that it's not as clear, whether or not ownership is as simple as we expected with, just owning a chair.
And I think that's right. And I think ideally, we don't think about it, right? We're just getting our product or getting our service. You mentioned we own our home. Yeah, I own my home. We're renovating our kitchen right now, but I didn't ask my bank. Technically, they own it because I haven't paid it off yet. Will mentioned, well, we buy our phones. Well, I think this phone, I did one of those 2-year contracts where I just paid per month. So I guess technically Verizon owned the phone until I hit my 2-year mark, right? You mentioned manufacturing. I was fortunate enough to be in Dayton 2 weeks ago. And yes, fortunate to be in Dayton. It was actually a good trip. I was there representing Commerce Secretary Pritzker for Manufacturing Day. Toured 5 factories. It was interesting. So ownership in terms of intellectual property ownership and ownership of parts. A lot of auto manufacturing parts going on there, but through the supply chain and other parts. So sometimes somebody comes, an inventor, and they tell the manufacturing plant, I need this designed. And so the manufacturing plant might sit down, and if they're actually getting involved in it, they might become a co-owner of the IP. In some cases, it's like, I just need this made. They own the IP. In other cases, maybe it's licensed. So I saw these grills being made for Dodge Ram trucks. Well, I assumed that the designer was licensing that to Ford, or maybe they were selling it to Ford. But we don't think about that. You just drive the Ram truck, right? And all this stuff is happening in the background, and it all works. And so we don't have to sit and think about intellectual property every day, and we don't have to think about ownership every day, as long as everything works.
Right, absolutely. And I mean, that's certainly something that kind of goes on in the background, and you may not notice when something bad happens, I guess. One thing that I think about a lot when I'm writing is the idea of technology and the law. Technology has rapidly progressed, obviously, through the past years. We've seen it in all these different new services. But has the law always kept up with that? In terms of privacy, oftentimes it has not, something that I read about regularly. And I honestly do not know all that much about patent law, but I know that you both do. So I'd love if you could talk to us a little bit about that.
If I could just first talk, so my media boss, USPTO Director Lee, she talks a lot about this and how we're moving into this intangible economy. and it leads to disruption. I don't think I've heard that word today, but it's common in this space, right? As we have these new products and services, they're disrupting business models. I think Airbnb can certainly talk about the mayor of New York and talk about some of the disruption that they're experiencing in terms of regulations. So it actually goes broadly. I do think it's important, though, to recognize that often you don't need to completely rethink the law. So we've been using the term sharing economy, but in reality, basically, it's like a rental economy, right? In the 90s, I was covering the tech boom, and I would appear on this CNN program called The New Economy Show. By its very name, the assumption was the economy was new, that pets.com, change your dog food provider, change the world. Then we had the bust. Turns out it was just the regular economy. So the sharing economy is changing the ways we can interact with each other and with products and services. But ultimately, it's still driven by economic forces. I think Susan would agree with that. And so you can work within the law, but you do have to recognize that there are going to be implications if you're an entrepreneur, and you need to maybe try to get ahead of those, which is what Director Lee advises people.
You know, one of the things that I think is interesting is, you know, we can talk about like how the law affects ownership, but you can also look at the reverse of how ownership affects law. And you know, one of the things is that when you have a device that you actually own, and then you know you can inspect it, you can figure out how it works, right? And what that means is if there's a problem with it, you can figure it out, you can publicize, you can tell people like, look, there's a problem with it, maybe you shouldn't buy this product, the government can get involved, do a recall, such things like that. A lot of times the devices we're buying these days are black boxes, right? We don't actually know what's inside them, and they actually put in restrictions to make it harder for us to open them up, figure out what's going on inside, you know, figure out their security flaws. And you know, some of those protections are even, you know, they're technological protections, right? You know, it's technology that's preventing you from getting inside. But you know, you might try to circumvent them. But there are actually laws that make it potentially criminal to try to circumvent that sort of thing. And you know, that's somewhat concerning because it means that we can't actually fully understand even the things that we supposedly own. You know, the whole thing with the VW emission scandal, I think, is probably one of the really good examples of that. People couldn't figure out that Volkswagens had this computer program inside them to cheat the emissions testing programs because you can't just go and open up the computer and you know figure out how the computer program works, right? You know, they put a whole bunch of layers of encryption and things on it to make it difficult to figure out what's going on. And you know, the car manufacturers have you know sought to block security researchers from actually doing that sort of investigation. And you know, in a pretty real sense, I find that as unfortunate because you know I think it's a real public service when people you know go out and figure out you know that these products might have some sort of defects or some sort of problems. And to the extent that companies are able to prevent them from doing that, you know that seems pretty worrying to me.
Absolutely. I mean, as a journalist, obviously, I speak for public awareness and transparency, so that's an important aspect of it. But also, I feel like this could be an issue in terms of creativity. I mean, when you have a device or something that you use, either you want to modify it in some way or you want to use that product to create something of your own, does your lack of ownership there cause problems for your sense of creativity, and kind of in what ways could you envision that?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that's kind of an issue. You know, one of my favorite websites is IKEA Hackers, where you know people will take I don't know a chair and then they'll turn it into something like completely. Or I think my favorite one was they took file boxes and turned it into an expanding table, right? So you know you like flip out the file box and you can actually make a table of whatever size you want. People do really cool stuff with materials that you would not expect. But you know, there are a lot of companies out there who they really want you to use the products the way that they expect. Lexmark is probably the most famous of these companies. They sell toner cartridges with what's called this prebate program, where they say you're only allowed to use the toner cartridge once. Once it's done, you have to return it to Lexmark. You're not allowed to do anything else with the cartridge. And you know what that means is that if you come up with some sort of unusual way of using it, for example, I think there were people who figured out how to put like food coloring into inkjet printer ink cartridges so they could print on cakes. If you figure out some cool thing like that, right, you're not allowed to do it because the manufacturer has put in controls that say you're not allowed to do it, and they've taken advantage of legal techniques to avoid that.
Yeah, I'm glad that both of you have mentioned creativity, by the way. And so I like this notion of being the end user creativity, like with your IKEA example. We do have, just like with the supply chain, we have creativity throughout the chain. So somebody came up with a way to design those pieces of IKEA furniture where you could assemble them with only an Allen wrench. Well, in theory, you can assemble them. Some of us have had challenges with IKEA furniture. But you think about lift, right? So it just seems intuitively obvious to us, and I enjoy using Lyft, and I also enjoy how easy it makes it to tip the driver. I like that feature. But we just heard that Lyft recognized this need and designed some algorithms to solve it. So that was creativity at the front end. And IP plays a role in that too. So it's important to recognize we think about it as end users, we think about ownership as the end user, and that's not a bad thing, but there's a full chain of it.
Right, absolutely. And then there are all kinds of new technologies coming out there that might change these questions. How is the Patent Office considering things like 3D printing? How could that sort of infringe on these things that other people have created?
So we held an event a few months ago. We call it additive manufacturing because I guess we're kind of nerdy, but yes, it's 3D printing. And one of the 5 manufacturing plants I toured only did 3D printing, and they've been around since '96. So I found that fascinating. This has actually been out in the marketplace for a while now. There are certainly implications in terms of copyrights and patents and trademarks, the ability to download something that may have a trademark from somebody else and manufacture it yourself. I think the consensus, though, is that this is truly a revolutionary technology that is really going to improve our lives. At that manufacturing plant, they were designing these parts that were going to be used actually in machines to make other things. And they were able to create passages and drill-throughs, for example, like fluids, oils for viscosity, that you literally physically cannot do with the drill. There is no way to drill through metal and get these things, right? And so we're going to have to work it out, just like with any disruption. We're going to have to figure out the nuances of IP, and some of them will make headlines. But more broadly, we're going to see great economic growth and opportunity from this.
Yeah, and I think one of the most exciting things about 3D printing, there are a lot of really exciting things about 3D printing. But one of the most exciting things I think is that it takes manufacturing that used to be in the hands of people who knew like how the entire supply chain worked. They knew a fabrication plant, and they knew the designers, and they knew the specifications for how to do drawings. It takes all of that and it puts into like the hands of you and me, right? I don't know any fabrication plants that can cast metal for me, but I know how to type things, right? And so if I come up with a design and I can design it using any one of the computer programs for 3D modeling, I can send that off to Shapeways, and a week later they give me the thing that I asked them to print. And I think number one, it's just really great. I'm really excited about the potential of 3D printing for replacing kids' toys, because I have a 3-year-old and he loses his favorite Lego every week. So I'm very excited about that. But more importantly, what I'm excited about is the idea of fast prototyping. The idea that right now, if I want to try out a new idea, it's going to take, I got to send it out to the factory. It's going to take like a month for them to manufacture it. It turns out there's a problem with it, so I have to redo the design. I have to send it out to the factory. It's going to take another month. It comes back. 3D printing, I just say, I want to tweak that design here. Let's just reprint it. It'll take an hour.
And you think about the auto industry, because we've talked about cars here, right? And traditionally, you'd get the new model every 4 or 5 years, right? Well, the car I own, they actually completely changed the interior from the 15 to the 16 model. I suspect that 3D printing was involved in that in part. And because they can make these fast prototypes, cheap and on the fly, they could test them, run through. And so I think we may not even 10 years from now, since we're talking future tense, we may not even have model years of cars, right? They may just kind of keep iterating them in real time, and you just keep getting the latest one. It changes the way we think about things.
Definitely. I'm curious whether or not you both think that types of 3D printing will butt heads with these big manufacturers. However, like with, we talk about Apple and the iPhone. I think I know probably hundreds of people that have broken their iPhones. I'm not one of them yet. Knock on wood, I probably will tomorrow, break my screen. But we were just discussing earlier in the green room about how it's incredibly challenging to replace that screen without spending a lot of money going to the Genius Bar, things like that. Do you think that things like 3D printing, things like other solutions will be good for that, but also butt heads with the big companies?
Yeah, you know, I really hope so. So yeah, I was talking about my my experience about a couple weeks ago of replacing an iPad screen. The process of replacing an iPad screen, in case any of you want to try this out, involves prying open the glass with a pry tool with one hand, while blow drying the glue that holds the glass together with the other hand. And because this glass is so thin, like the glass just like breaks off into small pieces. So you're sitting there, blow dryer on one hand, prying in the other hand, tiny pieces of glass are flying into your face. It's a wonderful experience. I did manage to do it. But you know what it says, I think, is something about the way that some of these manufacturers are treating these devices. That, you know, I also have an electric keyboard that I purchased maybe about 6 years ago. That thing is entirely held together with Phillips screws. I can take a screwdriver and open it up, replace the logic boards, clean off the keys, you know, do all the things that I want, screw it back together, and you know it works fine. And you know that process takes me maybe about half an hour. When companies moved from things like standard hardware to these pentalobe screws that they use on laptops, and to gluing things together, and to parts that can't be replaced, or you know parts that are custom fit so you can't replace them with other parts, it makes it a lot harder for people, you know, just to engage in like ordinary repairs of their stuff. And that means that, you know, if my iPhone breaks, a lot of times, unless you've got like a lot of skills and a lot of time, or are willing to, you know, go to some sort of very specialized repair shop, you probably just have to throw it away. And you know that I think is kind of unfortunate for a number of reasons. You know, first of all, it's unfortunate because I have to throw a whole device away because, you know, a small part of it might be broken. But second, you know, it's a recycling problem because, you know, it contains a lithium battery, and it also contains glass, and it also contains metal, and you know, if you can't separate them all out, then you know there's no way you can send that to a recycling plant. So you know, I think that this sort of trend is a little concerning, and 3D printing does make this a little better because it does offer the option of recreating, you know, very customized parts that you might not be able to find. So you know, if there's a particular, you know, curved bezel on an iPhone that, you know, is broken and you can't find the replacement for it, you could 3D print it, and then you would have it yourself. That I think is kind of cool. Right, but you know, a lot of companies, you know, they're not terribly happy with the idea. They want to be the only ones selling repair parts, and so I think that there is going to be something of a conflict there of incentives.
Absolutely. And as a journalist who works with a very kind of small segment, I work with people who are really interested in things like security. I know that there are a lot of users out there who have different priorities. Maybe the standard iPhone isn't necessarily a good example, they have pretty good security, but the standard Android user, most people have Androids in the country, but they don't have great security. And when they kind of push out this software and there's a flaw in it and they choose not to update it, and all these users are vulnerable either to criminal hackers, sometimes even state actors, depending on who it is. I've known certain people who are certainly at risk to that. How do we properly incentivize companies to be able to develop those things when they don't even give us the choice to do that?
So this is something that Commerce Secretary Pritzker is focused on a lot, cybersecurity, and NTIA is a part of Commerce, and she works a lot with them and other sub-agencies at it, including the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. It's a real challenge. We work a lot with startups at the USPTO. And generally what you see with it, especially a tech startup is, right, you see that engineer, the Wozniak, let's call it. You see the evangelist, the Jobs, and maybe they get in somebody who actually understands the money part, which is good. And then they just plow forward and they get those customers and they get those services. And so, you know, Secretary Pritzker and Undersecretary Lee like to remind people, well, you should probably early on be thinking about intellectual property, and you should probably be early on thinking about cybersecurity. Both of them are really hard to backload once you start getting down the chain, right? Now, in terms of creating the incentives, I mean, we're doing it through public education. We're going around, we're doing roundtables, we're talking to schools. We at the USPTO have a program called Camp Invention, where we work through 1st through 6th graders, and basically it's like a maker camp that you bring in old IBM Selectrics and modify them, and we try to help them understand some of these principles. But it's a serious problem.
Yeah, and security is kind of an interesting issue when it comes to like IoT devices. I mean, we all know about the recent internet outage, which was apparently caused by like IoT cameras that were very easily hacked because they had a fixed username and password that nobody could change, not even the users. And the thing is that there are kind of two approaches to dealing with security vulnerabilities. The first one, which I think is the sort of like, this is what you would seem to want to do, is lock the devices down as much as possible. Don't let anybody be able to access them. Make it really, really hard for anybody to figure out what's going on. And that it sounds very attractive, but the issue is that most of the security vulnerabilities that are discovered are not discovered by the company, right? They're discovered by third parties who do research on it. They do the fuzzing. They do the penetration testing, and they realize that there's something the company overlooked. A lot of times, especially these Internet of Things companies, they're design companies or the manufacturing companies, and software is kind of like second or third down the list for them. So software security may not be at the top of the priority chain for them, whereas it would be for users and security researchers. So that kind of leads to a different approach, which is open the device up as much as possible. Let people figure out what's going on. Maybe even make the software open source. And that way, take advantage of the crowd. They can figure out, what are all the issues. They can report on them, and then you can incrementally improve the device at a much more rapid pace. So I think that there is that aspect of just owning and understanding devices that is fairly significantly helpful to cybersecurity concerns.
Right, and you talk about security researchers. There's also obviously some areas of the law where we could fear penalties with kind of messing with those devices, interfering with patents, or the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act is something I run into sometimes. People are persecuted because they may just be doing security research to try to help the company, but they're penalized because they've accessed that system without authorization. What other sort of ways could people run into issues with doing that kind of tinkering?
Yeah, so the most often cited legal concern for this sort of activity is Section 1201 of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. So that section was originally designed as a way of enforcing DRM technologies on like music or DVDs or ebooks. The idea was that if they put on some sort of encryption or some sort of technological protection measure, they call it, that protects the internal copyrighted content, then efforts to circumvent that technological protection measure would be punishable as a crime and in civil lawsuits and any number of other ways. Companies have sought to use that as a way of protecting not just copyrighted content, not just like movies and ebooks, but also tractors and medical devices and all sorts of like Internet of Things products, because they all have software on them, and so the software is copyrighted, and so therefore the theory is that any technological protection measures on the device are protecting the software inside it. And I think that the assertion of that law apparently fairly strange way, that I think is somewhat concerning. And there are similar other issues with like CFA, of course.
Yeah, so Digital Millennium Copyright Act is an interesting thing to bring up, and there have been some isolated cases that were involved some kind of questionable interpretations of that. You may know that the U.S. Copyright Office actually has a procedure, and I think you guys have probably participated in that, where you can actually go and articulate ways in which you think it's not being used, and they can create exceptions, and they have created exceptions. We're not a law enforcement agency at the USPTO, but we did several years ago start a conversation broadly on copyright and innovation in the digital economy. And we did a green paper in 2013 and a white paper in 2015. What does that mean? Green paper is like, here are the problems, white paper, potential solutions. I didn't know that before I joined the government. We did it through the Department of Commerce, and we received so many comments. I know Public Knowledge participated in those as well. We had roundtables around the country. And one thing that we kept hearing over and over again is that there are these issues, but the marketplace is working some of them out. And so that was encouraging. And that's not surprising, right? Because we've been talking all day here about what do consumers want? What do we as end users want? Well, if you're going to have a bunch of consumers that are unhappy, then there's probably going to be somebody who's going to try to target that. So not saying that everything's solved or that there won't be future problems, but it is interesting to see, based on what we heard, that things are working themselves out in some ways.
Great. Well, I will stop monopolizing the two of you and open it up to the audience. Remember our previous instructions to please wait for the mic. And when you're asking a question, make sure it is a question and not just a statement. Anyone want to kick things off?
Next question? I do. I feel bad because I already asked one. That's why I was giving it some time. But I'm curious about changing attitudes in this space towards patent law and ownership. Are there partisan trends there? Are there trends or fault lines opening up between younger people who have different ideas about ownership and the role that patents should play in that? I'm curious mostly because I don't think about patents at all because I don't create anything, but I wonder if I'm representative of a millennial who would be involved in creating something, who would approach this without any of those questions about IP. So going forward, are you seeing any trends or resetting there?
So it's an excellent question. We do seem to live in partisan times, right? I will say, you don't think about patents that much, totally fine with that. I mentioned my kids earlier. They've been forced to think about it far too often because I bring it up at the dinner table. They're both in college now. I guess they're free from that. I will say that for the most part, intellectual property policy has been a pretty bipartisan issue. In 2011, Congress passed overwhelmingly bipartisan in both the House and Senate the American Invents Act, which we've implemented at the USPTO and has actually provided some tools to help improve patent quality, provided a stable funding, provided a post-grant court so anybody can challenge a patent if they think that it's illegitimate and bring it before this court. It's faster and cheaper than a US court. But I think what you're seeing here is that to the extent that there are divisions and debates in the patent community, it really has to do with your business model. Are patents essential to your business model, or are they peripheral? And in some cases, like trademarks, they're important to everybody. Lyft with the little flowy writing and the pink, I think that's a pretty important part of their portfolio. Patents, it varies from industry to industry, and that's where the friction lies.
I think addressing a sort of different part of that question, which I think is a great question. One of the interesting trends I see, particularly among younger people, is that we've talked a lot about sharing economy of like cars and music and things. There's something of a sharing economy of ideas too, I think. It started with I think it started with the idea of open source software, the idea that instead of I create the software and so therefore I am going to try to make a lot of money on it by selling it. I created the software, so I'm just going to share it with people, and other people can improve it, and we'll just have like a big community of people who are helping to put together this really cool, Linux operating system or open office word processing system. And then you kind of get to like different models of innovation even for other things. I think one of my favorite examples of this is Kickstarter, right? The idea that somebody can have a really cool idea, and a lot of times they obtain patents or trademarks on it, but sometimes they don't. But the idea is that the way that they profit off their idea is by saying, let's get a crowd of people who will be willing to contribute enough money to make it worth my time to manufacture this idea or put together this piece of artwork or do any number of things. And I think that, in a sense, really turns on its head the traditional way we viewed monetizing ideas, which is, I have an idea, I get a patent on it, I have the exclusive right to it, and now I go make the money. The idea is, I have an idea, I'm going to ask people for money for it first, and then I'm going to make the idea. So I think that we're starting to see kind of new business models and just new norms about how innovation can happen among, as technology develops and as we have generational change. That's really exciting to me, I think.
Does anyone else? Question? Was that a hand? There's one.
So a question on tinkering, as we, especially as you talk about iPads, et cetera, move towards more software that is touch enabled or voice enabled, there's certain things. I remember I used to work at Apple, and I could tinker and make Siri read things for some of my blind customers, but then they started locking Audible down or Kindle down where I couldn't make Siri read for the customers, and they had to go find a different app. So what's the solution in patenting and tinkering when it comes to disabilities and making sure that we are innovating for all groups?
So let me start by saying I've now learned that if I need to replace a glass on my iPad, I'm calling Charles. So we've got a tinkerer right here. There are lots of challenges in terms of this, and we were talking about this beforehand. I think all three of us share those. It's not always intellectual property, or it's not always patents. You mentioned the EULAs, the end user license agreements. A lot of these are simply business transactions, and most of us, we want that app, and so we're allowing it to get all this personal information, although when you read it, you're like, why do you need all this stuff? And so maybe that's where consumers can step in. Sometimes it hits on intellectual property, but a lot of times it's really more just a pure business model issue.
Yeah, no, I agree. And so Britt is playing herself down a little bit. She is the Mac repair expert. So
okay, I'm going to go to you. Actually,
she fixed all of the computers at Public Knowledge for a while. No, she's great. I think that it's right that a lot of these are businesses, right? This is an agreement or a dispute between Apple and Amazon on the issue of whether or not you're going to be allowed to play voice things over certain systems, and I think at least the first answer is that the people who are using these things just need to express that this is bad. Back when Apple was thinking of, I think, moving all of their iTunes music to DRM formats that you wouldn't be able to move onto different devices, there was a huge public outcry over that, and they actually walked that back and reintroduced the non-DRM format for, I think, like $1 more per song. So these companies, they have to be responsive to consumer concerns, and if people say, look, this is not what we want to be able to tinker, we want to be able to put our music on different devices and things like that, then I think they as a business matter have to listen.
I think we can fit one more question. And if not, I will ask one of my own. Anyone? No? Okay, great. So we've talked a lot, obviously, about specifics in terms of ownership and what we are losing, what we are gaining. But I feel like broadly, the average American might not know what things that they're losing. They might not realize the privacy implications. They may not realize that they cannot alter or tinker or have someone else do it for them. So how do we communicate those issues to the public?
So that's something that we think about a lot at the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. I mentioned our Camp Invention program. We actually have our collegiate inventors coming on the 3rd and 4th of November, and we do the National Inventors Hall of Fame. So they're out there talking to schools and talking to educators. It really has a lot to do with consumer awareness, I think. I think events like this are useful, and it's online, and so we'll be able to share that. I do think, too, and Charles can speak to this, there are times where consumers rise up and can speak more broadly and be heard, because ultimately that's what matters, right? The power of the consumer.
Yeah, no, just very briefly, I think that's exactly right. These issues affect consumers all the time, whether or not they realize it or not. And I think it's just a matter of realizing that all of those contracts that you sign actually mean something, and you might want to actually consider what the policy issues are behind that. And I think people are starting to realize that.
Oh, read the fine print. All right, thank you so much, everyone.
All right.
Great to have you.
Thank you.